I will try to link back this discussion that we had here in this session to the policy panel before. And in particular, I'm interested in saying a couple of words on how the ongoing trade conflict between the United States of America and China might affect us in Europe. I'll say a couple of words on the state of play. Then in the bracket, I talk a little bit about the incidence of tariffs. I do that because we published a study today on that, so I'll be short. And then give you a few general equilibrium, insights. Now, we can, put up tweets, endless stream of tweets, if you like. I have no time to read them out here, but it's very entertaining, and you learn a little bit about the mindset of Mr. Trump, how he thinks that the United States has been robbed by its trade partners, and then how he thinks that tariffs could remedy it. So these tweets are around and interesting to look at. Now, if you look at the US-China trade picture, what you find is, we have seen that before, I think Stefano had a picture, it's explosion of Chinese exports to the United States, and US exports growing less from a lower level, and an increase, that's the right-hand panel here, of the bilateral deficit of the United States with China, amounting to about 2% of GDP. One country only, 2% of GDP. That is by far the world's biggest bilateral imbalance that we see. Now, what's interesting is that, looking at goods trade, that's what Donald Trump loves to do. It's not the whole picture, but with China, it is almost the whole picture. What you see here is services trade. So the US have a little surplus in services, 50 billion. So it's not zero, but compared to the large deficit here in red in goods, this is really small. And the United States also has a deficit in what is called primary income. So Chinese investors earn much more on their US assets than the other way around. And that is driven entirely by the still relatively large holdings of Chinese investors of US government debt. If you look more closely into that, you see that the U.S. investors are earning net income on foreign direct investment. But if you compare it to Germany, the picture is very different. Germany is now running a current account surplus with China. Not huge, but 15 billion euros. It's nonetheless sizable. And also the traditional deficit in goods is almost gone. Yeah? So if you think about Europe's or Germany's position in this Sino-American trade war, one lesson that comes out from that is we are different. We are not, at least the bilateral position, we don't have this big deficit as the Americans. And what is true for Germany, as the largest economy in the Eurozone or in Europe, tends to be true for the whole of Europe as well. But of course, trade is one thing. The other thing is the geostrategic rivalry between the United States and Europe. I'm here just showing you the share of GDP that falls on the United States and on China over time. This is OECD estimates. What you see is that in 2024 or so, the Chinese economy will overtake the American one in current US dollars. In purchasing power parities, according to the sources that you look at, this has already happened. But it's also interesting is that in 2045, just taking business as usual forward without a trade war and breakup of the WTO and so on and so forth, the Chinese economy will reach its maximum, the maximum share, and then the aging of the economy and other forces will stop that. But the strategic rivalry, of course, has led to books like the one by Peter Navarro, the chief economic advisor of Donald Trump, who thinks that if we don't do anything, or the US don't do anything on China, then death by China is upon them. These are data that I thought I'll bring up because they come directly of Simon's database. I was asking myself, what does the US-China relationship look like in terms of protectionist measures compared to the China? That should be the European one. No, that's the other way around. That's China-US. I'm sorry. So what you see is that the US has been implementing a lot of harmful legislation against China, much less liberalization, though there is some here, and it falls on products like products of iron and steel, but also plastics products, motor vehicles. Yeah, so these are the three most important. The other way around is much less. Now, maybe Simon has miscalculated because that looks very nice from the Chinese perspective, but it could also be true. Let's assume it's true. No? That would be a picture, of course, that's quite harmful to the narrative in the United States, but it's because it seems, at least in the last 10 years or so, that the picture is quite the other way around. It's not the Chinese who are playing unfair games, who are enacting protectionist legislation, but it's quite the opposite. The US do that to China, not the other way around. Of course, we start here in 2009, and what the United States are maybe after is the level, is the situation, and what these numbers tell you is a change from 2009 onwards. But I think it's quite interesting that this asymmetry that goes totally against the narrative, at least the narrative that you hear in Washington, D.C. Containing China, so if you look at what countries have done to limit China's march to global dominance, you can count, for example, anti-dumping cases, so cases where Chinese firms are accused to sell below the fair or the normal value of their goods. Hilke has worked on that, and we have done some work on it. It's very shaky, typically, whether these are really cases where protectionists or where you could blame the Chinese to be protectionist, but okay. You see that the United States have been an important initiator of such cases. In the EU, just behind them, but the biggest one, actually, India. And if you also count countervailing measures, so these are measures you can adopt when China is illegally subsidizing their businesses. In those counts, these are WTO numbers, the US is by far the largest player there. The EU is only here at place number 4. And this is the universe of cases. Well, this is just the top 10 initiators. So in the field of countervailing actions, which target what many think is the problem in China, namely subsidies, we see very little action. But in this area here, anti-dumping cases, where you have to make the case that someone prices below some fair value, whatever that should be, that's where the action sits. And okay. Now let's talk about what has happened so far. Trump's timeline in this trade conflict with China. So there are essentially 2 trade laws that are being used. Famous Section 232, which allows the president to claim that the national security is threatened by imports of steel. That's what happened. Or also under investigation now, cars. And what we have so far is action against many countries, including the EU, but also China, on aluminium and steel. But much more has happened if you look at the Chinese case on Section 301. Section 301 has a mapping to Article 6 in GATT, which is about anti-dumping or also countervailing duties, where the claim is that the foreign partner is denying market access to your exporters. And that's where most of the action has been taking place. Date of activation, early July, 34 billion imports taxed by 25% on top of what the normal level is. So sometimes this turns out to be 40% or so. Then, 6 weeks or 7 weeks later, another 16 billion. Then, by the end of September, 200 billion of imports taxed by 10%. If nothing happens, this will go up to 25% by the end of the year. And then the threat to also subject the rest of the Chinese exports to the United States by some tariffs. Where do these tariffs, what are the products that are covered here? So on the 50 billion list, which is taking these 2 things together, because they belong to one list that has been going through the policy circles, you see it's almost all capital goods and intermediate goods. So the idea was to make firms pay for it and take the consumers out of the picture, fearing that if prices of consumer goods go up, the American public will turn against this type of policy. But then in the 200 billion list, you already see some consumer goods pop up there, and if the rest of the trade volume is going to be put under tariffs, there will be a large portion of it that will be consumers' goods. For the time being, for example, gadgets that everyone loves, like iPhones or other consumer gadgets, have not been covered by those tariffs. Now, can we say something? Can we already discern some effects of that? So maybe here on the right side, what is happening to monthly flows? So we can look into the data up to September. That's the last information that we have. And what's interesting is that imports from China have actually been going up all the time, month by month, and have reached an all-time high in September 2019. And the deficit, that's the yellow stuff here, the yellow shade here, the deficit has reached an all-time high as well. Some say this is because of anticipation effects. American firms, Walmart or whoever, Home Depot, they buy as much as they can before the tariffs kick in. But if you look at those numbers, they, as such, don't provide any relief so far. Over a longer period, what's interesting is that this is the time when Donald Trump became the 42nd or so president of the United States, February 2017. At that point of time, exports and imports were actually growing at almost the same rate. No? That is interesting. But in the very last information that we have in the data shows that things are actually diverging. That the exports are going down and imports are going up, and the balance is going up as well. That might be transitory, but and too early to say anything about whether the strategy functions or not. But it's an interesting thing happening here after such a time of joint evolution of these two numbers. Now, one thing that I have been trying to push over the last months again and again is to explain to people that the tariffs are just like taxes, and who pays those taxes is not something that we can trivially identify ex ante. No? Simply because the US government imposes an additional tax on an import from China, it does not mean that the American consumers or the American users of these inputs have to pay the tax, because it can well be that the Chinese exporters are willing to absorb some of this additional cost. No? And so that's the note that we have published today. If you're interested, here it is. And for the economists here, that's a almost trivial exercise in tax incidence. Public economists worry all the time who pays our taxes, and typically the tax burden is split. And the question who pays the tax at the end depends a lot on slopes of demand and supply curves, or on elasticities, as we say. If you happen to be inflexible, then that makes you bear a higher share as a consumer. So if you can substitute away and say, well, I buy my auto parts, for example, not from a Chinese supplier, but from a Mexican supplier, from an Eastern European supplier, then you will not be bearing the same burden of the tariff. On the producer side, the same is true. If you are very unflexible because you have a lot of fixed cost investment, and even a marginally unprofitable unit sold is still generating some positive margin for you, then you have a very steep supply curve, and then as a producer you will bear a large share of the tariff. And so what's interesting about the Section 301 tariffs is that the people at USTR had the opportunity to cherry pick. And what we find out in our study is that they cherry-picked with this type of framework in their minds. If we can use information from colleagues here, from Broda and others, or from Key and others, published information on how those export supply schedules and import demand schedules slope. We have information on these elasticities on a 4-digit level, so very disaggregate, and what we can show is that indeed the trade experts in Washington picked goods where the tax incidence is most favorable for the United States of America. Yeah, so I can now run through many pictures, but we are not doing well on time. So I refer to our study. What we essentially do is we take a very simple model, partial equilibrium model, which means that we keep incomes constant, which of course with a big scale trade war between the two largest economies of the world is not an innocent assumption. We have some more work that relaxes that, but essentially what we do is we implement these simple models. And what we need to know, of course, is how do tariffs change? You know, so and here what you see, for example, if it says 40, it means that the effective tariff on some intermediate goods here, small fractions of intermediate goods, is 40% after the 25% tariff has been enacted. And we can, for example, then ask, what is, given the model, the average price effect in the United States? And the insight is it's not big, because the Chinese exporters bear a overproportionate share of the tariff, 80% in most cases. You see, for example, that in consumer goods, the pass-through to American consumers would be largest, so excluding that is not as stupid as you might think. There's been commentary by Chad Bohn and others in Washington who said that focusing on intermediate goods is a stupid thing because that makes your own production more expensive. You know, it's clear. If you tax steel, and you build steel into your cars, those cars will be more expensive. You sell them abroad, that will hurt you. That's true. But on the other hand, this tax incidence logic makes you understand maybe why the USTR chose consumer goods to be exempted, because there the tax incidence is least favorable for the American consumers. Okay, so we can also look at the Chinese price effects. There, of course, are the opposite of the American. So in consumer goods, they would bear the least burden. And to wrap things up, what that simple analysis, with all its caveats, shows is that the choice in this Section 301 tariffs, of what tariffs they have imposed to additional taxes, has been cleverly made. Yeah? The bilateral deficit, to our calculations, goes down a little bit, not massively, given the fact that 200 billion of imports are affected, and the effects on US inflation are very small. So when the very stable genius tweets about price effects being very small, then he's right. And if he tweets that revenue effects are very big, he's probably right as well. Because if you think about this, that means that 140 billion of imports remain in the medium to long run. Subject that to 25% tax. That is something that matters. No? We're talking about 35 or so billion US dollars of additional government income. No? And if you net things up, the unfortunate end of the story is, as things stand, with a relatively modest retaliation of the Chinese, bottom line is positive for the United States. Consumers do lose because they pay higher prices. Some producers who use the inputs do lose as well. Those who are protected benefit. The US government benefits big time because of revenue income. And because the Chinese reduce their export prices, a lot of the additional tariff income that fills the coffers in Washington is actually paid by Chinese firms. So the bottom line looks positive, relatively positive for the United States. And the thing is, why is that so? That's because the retaliation has been relatively modest. The Chinese have not fought back with the same size as the tariffs that Trump has administered. Very quickly, what we also did is it's a different study here. We tried to understand in a general equilibrium framework how the trade war between the US and China affects us here. That is a little bit more complicated. Now we can't do that in a partial equilibrium model because now we have at least three parties involved. We have the two who fight and the bystander, Europe. We can be affected by trade diversion. These are substitution effects. We can be affected by competitiveness effect. For example, if the higher input prices in the US make US products less competitive. We can be also affected by an income effect. If the trade war makes China poorer, then they will demand fewer goods from Europe. And that is then essentially a question that we need to map into, we need a model to understand. And so that's what we do. We use the EFO model. And a few words on that. That brings me back to Hilke's analysis, because we have probably very similar features. We have these input-output linkages that are quite crucial to capture the competitiveness effect, for example. But what we also have is constant employment. This is what mostly is done in this type of work. We have a given aggregate trade balance. The assumption is that the exchange rate, the euro, US dollar, and the dollar renminbi exchange rates adjust such that the overall balances don't change. And what do we get? We get something like that. The blue bars here show what happens in a unilateral aggression. And now please, this is done for 60 billion US dollars. So this is only the first wave, not the second. So the numbers are probably much bigger if you take the most recent developments into account. But for that exercise, for the 60 billion, we see that that would cost the Chinese economy 2.3 billion in GDP. So that's taking all the general equilibrium effects into account and the adjustment of the sourcing and value-added chains. What you also see is that the Americans benefit. So that's the tax incidence optimal tariff story that I have told before. Not very much, but still some. And you also see that the EU is benefiting very, very slightly, 1.6 billion. Now, if the Chinese retaliate, and they retaliated in this case by exactly that amount, exactly the 60 billion, then the small benefit for the United States turns into something negative. So trade wars are bad, but the unilateral temptation is there to wage them. If you do a trade war, then the effects for the world become relatively large, 5.3 billion GDP lost. But again, for the EU and in Germany or Austria, my home country, there are positive numbers. That is, the substitution effects seem to dominate the income effects. There are a lot of caveats that you need to put into place here. Uncertainty in particular is not modeled. Most of the business cycle people would say, this is totally irrelevant for our exercise, because what matters is the huge uncertainty, the shake-up potentially of the world trade order, that is much more important. But there's also an upside. If in this trade war the Americans are able to open the Chinese market, we might benefit from that because we would be free riding. And some of that is already happening. For example, the Chinese have lowered car tariffs from 25 to 15%. Probably that would not have happened without the trade conflict with the United States. And they've allowed BMW to take a majority share in Brilliance in their joint venture. They can move it up from 50% to 75%. And that too may be an outcome. Now, what are the lessons of all that? So I think it's important to understand that the EU has been broadly a winner of the Chinese WTO accession. So work by my colleague Jens Südekum, for example, points towards that. And that is very much different to the United States, where the United States looks much more negatively affected. So we do not have the same interests relative to China. Some say we have, but I think that is not borne out in the data. I think the EU can gain most by adopting a position as a neutral mediator in the short run to avoid the worst, because we are in a position where we can talk to everyone. And finally, this has been here the song of the day, focus on a WTO reform rather than engage into joining the China bashing that the Americans are doing, or running and pay our dues to the White House. I think the focus must really be on the third item here. I'll stop here. I'm sorry we have overrun a little bit, but now, if you have questions, I take them, of course. But if not, yes.
Thank you for the interesting run-through. I don't know, maybe it's a very gross kind of a conclusion, but we should cheerleader than what Trump is doing, because we're benefiting from it, and the Chinese are more dependent on exports to the U.S. than vice versa. So just go ahead, of course, forgetting about the uncertainty.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think there is some logic to that. I wouldn't go and cheerlead, but I think the bad cop, good cop thing, it can't possibly work. I mean, there's also one thing that worries me. I mean, if you take this model to the extreme, and play a massive trade war, then the relationship between substitution and income effects might change. So there's no guarantee that the numbers will remain positive. So we shouldn't overdo it. But we could, instead of joining the United States in bashing China, we could also adopt a more neutral position and try to benefit from this situation.
Before coming to this quick conclusion that maybe we should not be so hostile against this policy, I would ask a question about the dynamic effects, because to a certain extent, maybe the debate is far more about the consequences for how to prepare for the big changes which will come. And we have all discussed fourth industrial revolution and the way how the different countries position or companies position themselves for this new round of competition. So my question, the dynamic aspect is, how do you see that this very arbitrary selection in the United States towards certain aspects of imports, also towards certain foreign direct investment, is linked also to a certain understanding of the competition for the future, one could say leading technologies and leading companies?
Yeah. Yes, I think this dynamic question is probably the most important motivation for policymakers. They think we need to do something now because China might overtake us. They could instead of us being the master of certain technologies, and we need to contain China first because many think it would be terrible if China would be leader not only solar panels and cell phones, but also in batteries or so. But that, of course, would be pushing or would be moving trade policy into strategic industrial policy, where first, I think, if you want to do strategic industrial policy, we have better tools than doing trade policy. And second, I would question strategic industrial policy altogether. The record being not very good. And even if our economics ministry in Germany always thinks that Airbus was the most wonderful example of industrial strategy, many would disagree. If you do the cost-benefit accounting, it doesn't look so terribly well. These are very expensive jobs. So, yes, I know this is the motivation. I think as economists, I would tell as often as I can, politicians, it's dangerous. We are sure we're wasting. We are sure that we are interfering with the static allocation of resources, and there's also a big likelihood that we get things wrong and that we champion the wrong industries. That would be. But I fully agree that this is what policymakers these days think a lot about.
Yes, I would like to come back on your conclusion that it actually benefits the US because of this tax incidence. I take your argument, and I agree that in principle this is a valid argument. My assessment of the quantitative issue is radically different in the sense, and we will publish an assessment of the price impact of these measures in a few days. And I think, and that's my understanding of what the literature has produced as estimates of pass-through of this kind of tariff shocks on prices. You're assuming that 1/3 is taken by the consumer in the US, 2/3 by the Chinese producer, more or less. That's your conclusion, not your assumption, that's your conclusion. The literature, my understanding is that it's more in line with 1/3 for the producer and 2/3 for the consumer. And that's one point. A second point is that typically the impact of such measures is also to induce other producers, those who are not targeted, to increase their prices, and in many cases by a large amount, in particular for the steel industry. And the sum of this is that, at least my assessment is that the inflationary impact of this measure is far larger. And potentially the gain linked to, which is actually a terms of trade gains that you're measuring here, I think is far lower. By the way, another issue is that there is an adjustment also possibly by the exchange rate. And the difference, it also decreases Chinese producer prices, but it also impacts negatively US exports, which changes significantly the assessment. That's a good argument, but from a different angle, my conclusion is not the same as to the final point, the final conclusion. And lastly, on the assessment of the potential benefits for EU exporters, I think for the time being at least, the overwhelming impact is uncertainty. So who would invest to take a market share which is just contingent upon the present measures, present protectionist measures? I think I would not do that if I were a manufacturing producer, and that's I think the overwhelming effect so far.
Yeah, I don't want to say anything against it. I think yes, you're right. The uncertainty effects are important. We have a hard time measuring them. No? So everyone talks about it. We have hard time conceptualizing them in our models. But my belly tells me that you are kind of right. That's maybe the dominating effect. On the 1/3, 2/3 thing, the 200 billion, the 200 billion imports targeted by tariffs. Don't include consumer goods so much, no? And so what we do see is a lot of heterogeneity across different goods, and so what we're looking at is a very non-representative sample out of the total imports, no? So it has been, I think, I was in May in DC and talked to people from USTR, no? And we're talking about lists at the time, about the Juncker list and other lists, and so I mean these people go through the elasticities. I mean, they understand the simple textbook cases, and they try to find goods or items where the tax incidence is favorable to them. But then, of course, if you take it a step further, and we also cover the other 267 billion, then we'll be entering into goods where the tax incidence is no longer favorable for the United States. So then we might actually be agreeing, right? Because we are using standard elasticities, maybe the same that you're also using, so at the end, once we go away from our selected sample into the full imports, then I guess the tax incidence will look very different and much worse for the United States. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think we are coming to the end of the day. We are over time. Let me conclude by saying two things. First of all, don't forget the conference continues tomorrow, so there's a set of parallel sessions on very interesting issues. And then I would like to thank the speakers, all speakers today, and in particular the speakers of this session, which was fascinating, really. And I would also like to thank Gabriel for putting together this fabulous panel. Thank you. Enjoy the evening.